When you are asked to think about the most violent rivalry in NBA history, you might say Jordan's Bulls versus the Bad Boy Pistons. And you'd be wrong. Yes, the Miami Heat New York Knicks feud had body slams, bench-clearing brawls, and even a head coach clinging to a player's leg during a fist fight. It all started when then six-time champion Pat Riley betrayed the Knicks by leaving for Miami, not just as their coach, but as the face of the Heat organization. He took his tactics from New York that had made them championship contenders, copied it, and built a team designed to destroy them. But what followed was 4 straight playoff matchups, multiple suspensions, and a rivalry so brutal the NBA had to change the rules to stop it. This is the story of the Heat versus the Knicks. Long before the Heat, Pat Riley would take over the Knicks in 1991, and the Showtime Lakers leader would mold them over his new image: tough, defensive-minded, and utterly relentless. Inspired by the dominance of the Bad Boy Pistons, the offensive finesse of the Lakers was gone. But under Riley's guidance, the Knicks became Eastern Conference powerhouses, reaching the NBA Finals in 1994, where they pushed Rudy Tomjanovich and Hakeem Olajuwon's Rockets to 7 games before falling just short of the championship. Now, the relationship between Riley and the Knicks seemed perfect from the outside. He had given the franchise an identity, restored pride to Madison Square Garden where they played, and brought New York basketball back to relevance. But behind closed doors, tensions were building that would ultimately tear everything apart. See, Riley wasn't just seeking success on the court, he wanted power in the front office too. The ability to not only coach the team, but to mold and create a team around players of his choosing. He wanted to develop a culture, and after tasting so much success as a coach, Riley craved a new level of authority in New York. His ego had cost him his job in LA in 1990, and here his ego would rise again as he pushed the Knicks ownership for an ownership stake and complete control over basketball operations. The Knicks, however, were unwilling to hand over such unprecedented power to their coach, no matter how successful he'd been in the NBA. Insert the Miami Heat. As contract negotiations between Riley and the Knicks stalled in the summer of 1995, the Heat saw an opportunity. They somewhat secretly and somewhat unsecretly reached out to Riley, offering him exactly what New York couldn't: complete control as both head coach as well as team president, along with a substantial ownership stake. For Riley, it was everything that he had wanted. It helps that he had backdoor connections and direct connections to the new owner of the Heat franchise. What would happen next, though, would go down as one of the most shocking exits that has happened from non-players in the league. But how would this take the savior of New York basketball and legendary coach and turn him into a villain and the centerpiece of a rivalry that honestly still exists to this day? June 15th, 1995. With no warning to the Knicks or their fans, Riley resigned from his position by fax. Well, he says otherwise, but of course he would. Make your own decision based upon this original footage.
It didn't make any difference whether I faxed it in, conferenced it in, phoned it in, had a satellite delivery of it in. I resigned 2 weeks before the fax, and the only reason why the fax has become fashionable is because I was ordered to send the fax by the commissioner. Otherwise, I wouldn't have sent a damn fax, okay?
Regardless, and officially, a fax machine message ended his 4-year tenure in New York. And it would come just days before the 1995 NBA draft, blindsiding the Knicks and throwing their offseason plans into chaos. They thought they had a team that could still compete for a title. And the Knicks had just finished off of going to the finals and almost made it again. They couldn't be far from the first championship since 1972, right? Well, turns out they would be, because they haven't won one since, but what made it worse was the revelation that Riley had been negotiating with Miami while he was still under contract with the Knicks. The betrayal cut deep. This wasn't just a coach leaving for a better opportunity. This was tampering, a cardinal sin in professional sports. In fact, one of the leaders of the Knicks front office called it the most blatant example of tampering I have seen in 12 years in the NBA. The NBA came down hard on Riley and the Heat. Commissioner David Stone fined them an unprecedented $1 million and forced them to send their 1996 first-round draft pick to New York as compensation. It was the steepest penalty for tampering the league had ever issued up until this day, but for Riley and Miami, it was a small price to pay for landing their dream leader. Would they be rewarded for their risk? Well, 100% in the future, but in the late 90s, that would remain to be seen. Riley's first move in Miami was particularly calculated. He began systematically building the Heat to counter the Knicks. He targeted players who could match New York's physicality, starting with the acquisition of Alonzo Mourning, a fierce competitor, all-star, and future Defensive Player of the Year, who could go toe-to-toe with Knicks center Patrick Ewing. Riley followed this by trading for Tim Hardaway from the high-tempo and fun Golden State Warriors. This gave the Heat a floor general who could counteract the Knicks' defensive pressure, and something Riley really wanted. Every move he made seemed designed not to just improve Miami, but specifically to target New York's weaknesses.
Riles, he developed that mentality in both of those teams. So those were his brainchilds, both teams. That mentality was developed, it was deep-rooted.
What made this rivalry uniquely hostile in the future wasn't just the bad blood. It was that Riley had created basketball twins in philosophy. Both were defensive-minded, physical, and intimidating. One was the original, one was the one he betrayed them for. How would these tensions now rise to the point that the players would feel every bit of aggression Riley intended to inflict upon the Knicks, and who would step in for New York to fight back against the traitor? Well, back in New York, Riley's departure had created a wound that wouldn't heal. His former players felt abandoned, management felt deceived, not as much as most of you who might not even know what a fax machine is, but it was the fans who took it most personally. Riley had been the face of their basketball comeback story, and now he had not only left them, he joined a direct division competitor. And with the NBA being structured into divisions within conferences, the Knicks and the Heat would play each other 4 times every year just in the regular season alone. When Riley returned to Madison Square Garden as Heat coach for the first time on December 19, 1995, he was greeted with a reception that, well, only the citizens of New York could pull off. Every time Riley stepped on the court or even appeared on the Jumbotron, he would hear a lot of boos. The Knicks were determined to show Riley he had made a mistake. It was personal. Well, in this first game, New York would win that battle easily. But it was just the opening meeting in what would become a years-long war. But Pat Riley alone would not cause the hatred and the anger on the court. So what would turn this simple frustration into a bitter feud? How exactly do you make professional athletes hate each other enough to risk million-dollar careers over a single basketball game to the point where even coaches would get involved? While Pat Riley was duplicating the Knicks over in Miami, who would actually help New York once he had already left and continue his methods of success? When the Knicks needed a replacement, they didn't search far. Well, actually first they did search far in that they wanted the Bad Boy Pistons coach Chuck Daly. He said no. And then they replaced Riley in the form of Coach Don Nelson. But given he was more relaxed, experienced, and notoriously only focused on offense, he was fired. But then they didn't have to look far. Jeff Van Gundy, Riley's loyal former assistant, stepped up to fill the massive void. And this wasn't just a coaching succession, it was the perfect setup for the war against the Heat. And that is how Riley would see it. Both men knew each other's playbooks, tendencies, and weaknesses intimately. Van Gundy had absorbed Riley's defensive philosophy like a sponge during their years together.
We knew each other's plays, we knew everything. That's why the scores were so low, you know?
Battles.
Yeah, I mean, the score ended up being, a lot of games 82 to 85.
Yeah.
That was a score, because we knew each other's plays, It was a dogfight. Defense was knocked down, dragged out, possessions, hard fought.
Yeah.
We knew them in and out, and they knew us so well that, it was just really man to man. It wasn't no trick plays, wasn't getting no trick baskets. I just remember it being all guts and glory.
The mentor-protege relationship quickly transformed into something far more complex. And over the years, the words exchanged between them in the media would get less and less friendly. The roster similarities extended beyond the stars, though. Charles Oakley and Anthony Mason embodied the Knicks' physical style with their bruising screens and intimidating presence. Riley answered with P.J. Brown, a quiet brawler who didn't trash talk, he took your soul with a screen. Both teams featured role players who embraced contact, set bone-crushing screens, and made opponents pay for thinking they could score easy layups, or dunks, or score at all. What truly elevated the intensity was the Georgetown relationship between Ewing and Mourning. As Ewing said, they wanted to dominate each other, but it would be a little bit more than that.
It was just inevitable that this was going to be a war.
Enzo was one of those guys like, hey, I'm the pupil, but I've grown a lot. I'm not the same guy that I was that you remember at Georgetown, and I'm coming out here to kick your butt also.
We have definitely a brotherly type relationship off the court. When we were in between those lines, it was a totally different attitude.
It's just like two gladiators that know each other, don't want to go against each other, but have to.
Whether or not they would remain close as the next few years went by would remain to be seen, The Heat would lose the regular season matchup in this first year 3-1, and then they would lose in the first round of the playoffs to the 72-10 record-setting Chicago Bulls. No shame in that. Beyond all the discussion though, no real violent rivalry had developed. But could the 1996-1997 season prove differently? Oh yes, each game featured multiple technical fouls, near fights, and physical play that pushed the boundaries of the rulebook and even shredded the rulebook. The similarity in playing style meant neither team could impose their will easily, and again, it was like looking in the mirror trying to intimidate your own reflection. Both squads prided themselves on physical defense, so much so that they were the number 1 and number 2 defensive rating teams for that season. The brutal physicality wasn't just tolerated, it was the entire game plan. Remember, there have been a lot of rule changes that came about in the early 90s thanks to Riley's Knicks really pushing the boundaries of stepping on the court and physical fouls. Though he knew how to make his team execute that and also be disciplined when necessary. And this would prove valuable very shortly. And while both teams were disciplined physical teams, where the violence wasn't random, it was calculated, players knew exactly when to deliver a hard foul, when to set a screen that would send a message, and when to stand for teammates. But the playoffs are where those ideas go to die. By the end of the year, Miami weren't just good, they were great, notching a 60-win season, always a sign of a championship favorite. The Knicks would have 57 wins, but sadly, given they were in the same division as the Heat, would finish second. Much like you might finish second if you don't consider subscribing to the GOAT Authority, while Riley won his 3rd ever Coach of the Year award for 1997. What this would do though is set up the true beginning of the rivalry. How would a playoff series between contenders who were bitter rivals already play out? And to what degree would each team become more physical than any matchup in NBA history? Their hatred was intense, the same man had built both teams, and it wasn't just about beating each other, it was about proving which version of Riley ball was superior. Miami would have a tough first-round series versus Orlando, but would win 3-2, and the Knicks would sweep Charlotte with ease. And then the 1997 second round set the stage for the first postseason confrontation between Riley's Heat and Van Gundy's Knicks. The first of 4 playoff meetings in a row, something that had not happened in the history of the league, and nobody predicted how quickly basketball strategy would be overshadowed by raw violence. Despite Miami holding home court advantage as the Atlantic Division champions, the Knicks dominated early, taking a commanding 3-1 series lead. The physical play that defined their regular season matchups had now intensified, with each possession feeling like a battle for survival. It might be overdramatic, but hold that thought, it isn't. Game 5 at Miami Arena had all attention of a literal basketball heating up and waiting to explode. The Heat, facing elimination on their home court, came out with a desperation that manifested in increasingly physical play. Elbows landed harder, screens felt like car crashes, the officials' whistles became background noise as both teams tested how much they could get away with. And with just 153 remaining, and the Miami Heat leading 86-72, Knicks guard Charlie Ward lined up for a free throw rebound next to Miami's PJ Brown. As the shot went up, Ward attempted to box out by diving low with Brown's knees, a move that Brown viewed as dangerous and potentially career-threatening. I mean, it was, but then Brown snapped, and in one violent motion, he lifted the much smaller Ward and body slammed him beyond the baseline. The Miami crowd erupted. Knicks players John Starks, Allen Houston, Larry Johnson all instinctively rushed towards the fight. Patrick Ewing also slightly stepped on the court, but this undisciplined reaction would seal their fate. The Heat players, notably, remained on the bench knowing exactly what Riley would want, and I'm sure he was smiling deep inside. Security ran onto the court, the officials struggled to restore order, but their true destruction came after the game, from NBA Commissioner David Stern's office. The Heat had won, but Stern responded with discipline that had never been seen before. PJ Brown received a 2-game suspension for Game 6 and 7 for initiating the fight, but the ban hammer would fall harder on the Knicks. 5 players faced suspensions: Patrick Ewing, Allen Houston, Larry Johnson, John Starks, and Charlie Ward. The team's core rotation, all suspended. But the bigger problem, they decided to stagger the suspensions across Game 6 and 7. Game 6 at Madison Square Garden became mathematically impossible basically for the Knicks. The Heat capitalized and won 95-90. Still close, but a win is a win. And in Game 7, Miami showcased the full impact of the suspensions. Without Larry Johnson and Starks, the Knicks were not able to keep up. Tim Hardaway torched New York for 38 points, while the depleted Knicks struggled to generate any consistent scoring. Miami completed the comeback, becoming just the 6th NBA team in history to overcome a 3-1 series deficit. Knicks coach Jeff Van Gundy didn't understand why Ewing was suspended.
All those guys who came on the floor, that's our fault as coaches and as players. We deserved what we got.
Sure.
to suspend Patrick
Yes.
was vengeful. He did nothing. He took one step on the floor and looked. That's it. I don't know why.
For the Knicks, this just wasn't another playoff loss. This was theft. They genuinely believed they had been robbed of their best opportunity to reach the finals. The Chicago Bulls, who had dominated the Eastern Conference for years, were still primed for titles, but the other Eastern Conference teams were hungry and wanted a shot. Many Knicks players believed their team, not Miami, was best positioned to challenge Chicago. And in this case, no one will ever know, but the Bulls would deny the Heat their first ever chance at the finals with a swift 4-1 defeat on their way to MJ's 5th ring. The aftermath transformed what had been an intense but still professional dislike into genuine hatred. Knicks players publicly questioned the fairness of the suspensions, suggesting the league had effectively handed Miami the series. While the prevailing opinion was simply stay on the bench and don't get suspended, Riley simply acknowledged how similar the teams were. No more similar than your left and right hand. The rivalry had gone nuclear. And would it be more possible for it to get even more intense with even more on the line for both teams? As former teammates Alonzo Mourning and Larry Johnson brought years of hatred into a playoff environment. But nobody could have predicted that a 5'9" coach would create the most unforgettable image in NBA playoff history by literally putting his body on the line for his players. But for this image to make sense, you have to ask what would even allow this to happen in the first place? And how layered would the Knicks-Heat rivalry end up being? Well, behind this lurked an even more personal feud. Before joining Miami, Alonzo Mourning and Larry Johnson had been teammates in Charlotte. Now, they obviously had some good times. However, there was friction when it was time to get paid. Mourning would go to the Heat, Johnson would go to the Knicks, and the tension would follow them to their new teams. Although nowadays they wouldn't necessarily say that. Back in the day, Larry Johnson openly said, "He is not my friend." There were also rumors about Larry Johnson taunting Alonzo Mourning in Charlotte with his Rookie of the Year jacket. They may have made peace nowadays, but when you have a fight compilation video on YouTube and you're competing that hard, it's definitely an intense matchup, and that played into this rivalry just as much. The backstory added explosive potential to the 1998 Knicks-Heat playoff matchup. The Heat again had a great year, finishing second in the East, while the Knicks pulled up in 7th with only 43 wins. This set up a first-round playoff matchup where the Heat were heavy favorites to take the series. After the previous year had cost the Knicks a series via the suspensions, New York entered with a vengeance. Despite Miami holding a home court advantage as the higher seed, the series would be tied 1-1 before Miami finally took the third game. Game 4 at Madison Square Garden presented the Heat with an ability to close out, but the contest was physical from the opening tip. Tim Hardaway faced relentless defensive pressure from the New York team. Well, he had ended their season last year, so they were pretty motivated to stop that 38-point explosion from happening again. With less than 2 minutes remaining and the Knicks ahead by 8 points, what should have been a routine possession suddenly erupted into chaos. As Charles Oakley secured a rebound, Mourning and Johnson began exchanging words. In an instant, both players squared up and started throwing punches at each other. What happened next became the defining image of the entire rivalry. In a surreal moment captured forever on film, Van Gundy lunged for Mourning's legs, wrapping himself around the 6'10" center's calf like a koala bear clinging to a tree trunk. As Mourning tried to continue swinging at Johnson, he dragged Van Gundy across the court to the point that the New York Times would say he became the little big coach. And yet, it was perfect. In a rivalry where pride ruled all, Van Gundy was willing to lose his to protect his players. And he said he'd do it again. The intention really was just to break up the fight and to get in between them so they could avoid suspensions, so the players themselves could avoid an embarrassment. The consequences were swift and significant. Both Mourning and Johnson received automatic injections and subsequent suspensions, but unlike the previous year when 5 Knicks players had been suspended, Van Gundy's quick intervention had kept his players in place, and as such, no additional Knicks faced punishment. And the Knicks would win Game 4, tying the series up at 2-2. Riley would add fuel to the fire, not that it really needed anymore. The only one out of control the other night was him. Totally. A guy starts lobbing spitballs and somebody's going to turn on him. Though Van Gundy would not return this sort of aggression and would just say he appreciated Riley for everything he did for him, with Mourning suspended for Game 5, the game became incredibly defensive, even though it would have been anyway, but neither team would reach 80 points and Miami would just struggle to score. Tim Hardaway would try and be the hero, but the Heat just couldn't generate enough. The Knicks, despite missing Johnson as well as Ewing, closed out the series with a gritty 17-point victory. The celebration was especially sweet given how they'd lost the previous year. For the Knicks, it was redemption. For Riley and the Heat, it was a bitter cookie to eat, or not eat. Losing in the same way you'd won last year, but you were now the 2nd seed and they were the 7th, not something Riley really enjoys. However, as league officials scrambled to adjust rules to change the nature of the NBA and the product they were putting out because of this rivalry and the fighting, they couldn't possibly know that the most brutal blow in this rivalry was yet to come. Except this time it wouldn't be about punches. The physical damage had now been done. The next thing would be violent mental trauma that still haunts Miami Heat fans to this day. For the 1999 season, a bitter lockout between players and teams had reduced the amount of games played in the regular season to just 50, creating a frantic sprint where every matchup carried more significance. Remember that while these are just the playoff battles, they also had to meet themselves more time than any other team in the regular season. Miami and Pat Riley were growing impatient. They had championship aspirations. They dominated the Atlantic Division again with a 33-17 record, and they were now the #1 seed in the Eastern Conference. Michael Jordan retiring allows that. Meanwhile, the Knicks barely scraped into the playoffs as the 8th seed, setting up a first-round matchup that appeared to heavily tilt in Miami's favor. But what would be different this year over last year? Would this 3rd consecutive postseason battle have the same suspensions, fights, and career-defining moments, or would it unfold a little bit differently? While Riley's bully ball would still dominate the league in the 90s and still be the same exact sort of playstyle you got in this series, every possession was even more a war of attrition, with the average score for both teams being 81 over the 5 games. The team split the first 4 games, setting up a decisive Game 5 back in Miami. That's right, in the first round it was only best of 5 up until 2003. I'd say Game 5 would unfold exactly as you'd expect, but at this point you have to expect the unexpected with these two. Though it was a defensive struggle, it came down to the very end of the game. With 4.5 seconds remaining and the Knicks trailing by 1 point, New York's Allen Houston caught an inbound pass near the 3-point line.
Stop, down the lane, running jumper, up the front rim, and in! Allen Houston, Houston ducks under, got it! With 8 tenths left!
The roar of the Knicks fans sounded over the silent Miami crowd as the scoreboard displayed a devastating reality. Knicks 78, Heat 77. For Alonzo Mourning, it was a moment that replayed in his mind for years. "We shot ourselves in the foot," Mourning said. "By far, we're a better team than they are. It's not like they annihilated us."
That rivalry became one of the greatest rivalries in the history of the game without it ever being a championship rivalry. Every single possession was life or death, and that's how both teams went at it.
Would Riley feel that way about the rivalry in the moment though, because Alonzo Mourning was wrong. It was the 2nd time only in NBA history that a top seed had lost and been eliminated in the first round to an 8 seed. Pat Riley stood motionless on the sideline, his trademark slicked back hair and tailored suit unable to mask the fact that it had happened again. "We should have won in spite of it," he said. "This is a very difficult one to take. We were at home. It's a hard way to lose." The devastation of Houston's shot was amplified by what happened next. The Knicks, supposedly outmatched as an 8th seed, rode the momentum from the Miami upset all the way to the NBA Finals. They became the first 8th seed to reach the championship round, something ironically that wouldn't happen again until Miami would do it in 2023, which was evidenced by the fact that they got decimated by the San Antonio Spurs in 5 games, who were definitely not an 8th seed. The Heat had dominated the regular season again, only to fall in the first round on what they would have called a lucky bounce. What made it even more painful was watching their hated rivals use their postseason demise as a springboard to compete for a championship, somewhere Riley deeply wanted to return to, and this would only cause the hatred to deepen. For above all things, losing is something Riley really hated, and this was to his former team and protege as well, to the point that he said, "Jeff and I equate losing with dying." At the peak of the rivalry, what were both coaches doing though to stoke these flames? How were they using their team's absolute dislike of each other in a way to bring out an aggressive battle of basketball so violent it would soon be banned by the NBA? Well, Riley's leadership style was built on calculated intimidation. He would deliberately cultivate an us-against-the-world mentality for his teams, convincing his players that the entire basketball universe, especially in New York, was conspiring against them. During film sessions, he'd highlight every negative headline and making the team feel like every game was a fight for dignity. He turned the incidents like the infamous brawls into rallying points, not distractions. And if you knew his tactics with Magic Johnson in the 80s to get him over the Celtics hump, this really isn't a new thing. Van Gundy, meanwhile, weaponized his underdog image. Where Riley projected strength, Van Gundy embraced perceived weakness. He'd even absorb his players' technical fouls by getting them himself, stepping between officials and his stars to protect them from ejections. This wasn't just desperation, it was a calculated display of loyalty that his players never forgot. Both coaches understood that emotional investment creates competitive advantage. They both deliberately kept that temperature high between these series and between these games by coaching in the media with their comments. At times, both coaches have spouted inflammatory remarks that have added to the ill will. And every time you say something in the media and the other team hears it, it acts as motivation. And this is now heightened over years and years. By the time the ball tipped in these games, players weren't just executing a game plan, they were defending the pride of the organization and their coach against their mortal enemy. To bring this brutal rivalry to its head, fortunately for viewers and unfortunately for Knicks Heat fans, in 2000, the basketball gods delivered another playoff matchup, their fourth consecutive postseason encounter. This time, Miami earned the second seed while New York entered as the third seed, which means they would not meet in the first round for only 5 games. The stakes were higher always in a 7-game series, and the tension, yeah, you know. And this battle would be the closest they would have. But first, they would have to take care of their own business, and they would, both teams easily sweeping the first round 3-0, and this set up a second round battle. Both teams had spent years developing and trying to get to the finals and win a championship. This would be the most important series of the most violent rivalry. But who would triumph this time? Could Riley and the Heat finally make progress in the playoffs and defeat their original twin? Miami would strike first, defending their home court with a nice little win, only for New York to grind out an 82-76 victory in Game 2. Now we go back to Madison Square Garden. Sadly, Game 3 for the Knicks here would be like Game 5 for the Miami Heat the previous year. While Patrick Ewing forced overtime with a clutch jumper and later gave the Knicks a nice lead with a few seconds left, Miami's rookie guard Anthony Carter would loft a near impossible shot from behind the backboard, one that defied logic and perhaps even the rulebook. It would hit the front rim and drop in with 2.1 seconds left. This would steal the game for Miami 77-76. The Knicks even contested, the officials let it stand, and obviously in Madison Square Garden, everybody was pretty upset. Though they would get revenge and tie the series at 2-2. Back in Miami for Game 5, the Heat delivered what seemed like a really great dagger game. With time winding down, they would drill a barrage of three-pointers, erasing New York's lead and securing an 87-81 victory. But if this rivalry had proven anything, it was that no lead was ever safe and no team was ever safe from having all their players. As we head into Game 6, Miami had a commanding 45-30 point lead at the halftime and looked like they were finally able to win this series and get revenge on New York. But then the Knicks were able to actually come back. Ewing's emphatic tip and dunk would actually bring the game within reach before Allen Houston's free throws would seal a 72-70 point win. It was time for another Game 7. Again, Miami would build a big double-digit lead only for New York to fight their way back. Tim Hardaway would hit a clutch 3 to put Miami up, but in another undisciplined moment, Alonzo Mourning, the superstar for the Heat, would gamble for a steal, he would miss, and Ewing would be open for the dunk. That would give New York the lead for good. The Knicks were able to try get a last shot off, but it didn't go down, and once more the Knicks had knocked out their bitter rivals in a Game 7, and once again, 2 years in a row, it was in Miami. The Heat once again were in disbelief, their championship dreams shattered once more by the team they hated most. In 4 straight playoff battles, the Knicks had eliminated the Heat 3 times in a row. And despite Miami's regular season success, New York consistently found ways to break their hearts when it mattered most. Fortunately for Heat fans, the Pacers would defeat the Knicks, again as they'd done many times in the 90s, and while Pat Riley wouldn't win against the Knicks in these playoff battles, he would have the last laugh by recognizing how he had to evolve with the times as a team builder, sometimes step back from coaching, and of course he would lead them to the 2006 title and win a few more in the LeBron James era. The Knicks didn't win very much at all. But what is certain is this most violent rivalry did change basketball. Yes, Riley had been at the center of this since the early 90s and forced already a lot of rule changes, but as the deputy commissioner said at the time, I think we all realize there are some problems we need to address as far as how the game is played. The sentiment was we have to have less contact. As the game has evolved, there's way too much contact away from the ball. The league already made a lot of defensive changes in 2000, They would continue to make them over the next couple of years, and these modifications gradually transformed the NBA from a defensive, physically punishing league to the high-scoring, perimeter-oriented game we see today. What began as a coaching move in 1995 became a 4-year war that changed NBA basketball. The Heat-Knicks rivalry was basketball at its most violent and emotionally heated. But if you want to see actual championships, then Pat Riley's 9 rings are a story worth seeing. Or if you love the modern game more, Kerr also has 9 rings. Click either for GOATness.